This is greytFM, a podcast series by greytHR, produced by Timber Media.
Back to a new episode of greytFM, everybody. Ahalya here, keeping you company. And a while ago, there was a video report, right, on First Post claiming that Gen Z is officially the most difficult workforce in history. Now, I have to say, as someone who is part of that generation, it took me by surprise. And the report fueled a lot of debate about whether Gen Z is, in fact, a workforce like no other. There were supporters, there were naysayers. Gen Z is the generation of the workplace today, and every generation is defined by so many different factors. So how do those factors affect hiring and retention strategies at work? Does the workplace need to significantly change? Who has to adapt to what? There's a lot to unpack here, and we're talking about a conversation for the future. So it's an important one to have. Let's discuss with the help of Bhavna Batra, Vice President, People, S&P Global. Hi, Bhavna. Such a pleasure having you on the podcast. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much for having me here today. This is an exciting conversation, so I'm delighted to be here.
I do have to call that out right in the beginning. I think you, as one of our speakers, has got one of the more controversial, thought-provoking topics of conversation. So I'm really excited to get into it with you. Let's dive into it. I think I want to start on an experiential thread. What has been your experience with a Gen Z workforce to start us off?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I'm a millennial. I would like to call that out because somewhere it helps build a little bit more relatability with the Gen Z population that I typically interact with. And there are a couple of things that really stand out as I think of Gen Z population. One, the fact that this is a group that does not like to be labeled and yet is labeled as being perhaps one of the more enigmatic generations to work with. A few characteristics which I would describe as almost contradictions when I think of folks who are born to Gen Z, which is called Gen I or digital natives. So many other terms are used to describe them, right? This is that one generation which strikes me as being digital natives on one hand, and yet at the same time, in spite of all of the connectivity that is there, I do feel that this is the generation where there is a little bit more sense of isolation that is there. We are seeing a lot more, focus on mental health, mental well-being, overall well-being that is there. The second one is that this is a generation that has been born into a world which has multiple identities that are parallelly at play. So one person can actually live in different realms with very different identities. But this is also the generation that is far more exacting in terms of the ethical standards that they expect to see demonstrated, and they hold themselves accountable to as well. This is a generation that loves communication. I don't think there's too much communication when it comes to Gen Z, and yet this is the generation that has the shortest attention span. And therefore, the need for communication to be crisp, on point, and not, sort of meandering and causing them to lose attention. So those are maybe a few initial thoughts.
Okay, I like that. I think you've set the stage pretty well. So let's dive into the whole differences thing, because what came out just now from your response is also this idea of great juxtaposition, which I think is intriguing, fascinating, even for members of the Gen Z workforce in this generation. I think we ourselves find, moments of thinking about this juxtaposition. So every generation has different needs and requirements or, priorities. And those are almost always framed by a larger socio-economic trend, right? Yeah. It's more macro than it is micro. And it is best not to generalize, but then it always happens. So what are the biggest differences that one has to contend with in the workplace today? And do they all really boil down simply to generational differences, in your opinion, Bhavna?
Yeah, I will start out by saying that classifying everything as a generational difference is a little bit of a cop out, because I really believe that labels don't work and generations are also a label, right? I do believe that human beings have individual contexts, individual preferences, individual influencing factors, and therefore it is important to account for those. Having said that, when we are looking at organizations, which do bring in scaled workforce, there is some value in taking a generational view, because that just helps us create some basic minimum that we can then start to build off of, right? Some of the realities of operating with a Gen Z workforce, specifically in a context where today we have at least four generations in play, right? You still have baby boomers who are very much active. You have Gen X, which is occupying a lot of leadership and senior roles. You have millennials and you have Gen Z as well. I think in this kind of a context, I have found that two, three expectations are very strong. One pertains to tech. And, I often say this, that our Gen Z colleagues have the expectation that enterprise tech will work with the same seamlessness that WhatsApp does. Given the realities of security, of protocols, etc., that's not always possible. But given that expectation of simplification, of, not getting caught up in needless complexity, I think they do help constantly redefine the standards of what makes good tech happen. So that's one aspect. I think the other aspect that I will call out of working with the Gen Z population is being real, being authentic, being honest, and really saying it the way it is, right? I spoke about the fact that ethics are very important to Gen Z. So is transparency, right? And how do you create a balance between what can be shared and what perhaps needs to be looked at with some degree of transparency, but not 100% transparency, because it is not possible to have 100% transparency on everything. But how do you have authentic conversations? I think that's the other element when it comes to working with the Gen Z workforce.
Yeah. And you, I think through the course of your career, Bhavna, have always had a very, leading with heart kind of approach, right? And have therefore been able to affect change at so many different levels in the corporate world. But I also do want to ask you, because a big part of that trajectory is obviously identifying opportunities, right? So when you look at a workforce that is comprising of Gen Z professionals, what do you think are the biggest opportunities there that can actually take us forward?
I feel the biggest opportunity is to make them part of the ideation process and make them part of the options that are getting debated and that are on the table, right? That very classic view that thinking happens at the top of the pyramid, execution happens at the bottom of the pyramid, and the middle of the pyramid really acts as the link between the thought and the action is quite passe in my view. I think today at every single level, there is thought, there is thoughtful action, there is reflection, there is course correction. And the second we start making our Gen Z a part of the conversation, a real part of the conversation, that's when we see the difference happen. So I personally really like the idea of Gen Z councils, for instance, right? Or shadow boards that are comprised of Gen Z colleagues, because that is a way to bring in some very different questions, some very different conversations, but also to help the Gen Z colleagues also appreciate that while inputs and ideas and thoughts are great, those need to be delivered upon, and therefore driving that accountability for results. So I think get them involved in the conversation, but then also hold them accountable to the highest standards of performance. And when they deliver, then make sure that they are appreciated, because real-time appreciation is definitely an important driver.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting way to integrate, right, workforces of different generations, a multi-generational workforce, and make the most of the moment, I guess. Let's, expand the conversation a little bit, include other generations as well. For HR professionals today, Bhavna, it is a fine line to walk, I guess, in the process of this transition. One's got to acknowledge the generational differences and cater to them, but then also not make them the focus of everything, right? Every single function, every operation. So what is your advice on walking that line and then eventually creating a workplace that helps everybody thrive in the best way for them?
Yeah, I love that question. And the reason I love that question is because it really is about helping us as a HR fraternity think long and hard about what is it that we're driving? How are we adding value? So my view really is, and I'm going to take a very specific example, like let's take the example of benefits. Um, for the longest time, one of the benefits that was really coveted was the kind of medical insurance coverage, right, that organizations offered to colleagues and their families. The reality, however, is that most Gen Zs, I'm now going to talk about urban Gen Zs, a lot of urban Gen Zs are coming from a context where perhaps their parents are covered by medical insurance in their own right, in some shape or form, and therefore medical insurance may not be a differentiating benefit for them, right? Now, in this kind of a context, how do we think about our options with flexibility, be it benefits, be it leave, be it the way we do the performance experience, be it the way we drive learning? I was reading an article and it spoke about how, in a particular organization, the Gen Z colleagues asked their manager for a week off because they were coping with trauma. And the manager actually said, I hope you're okay. And can you share a little bit more about the kind of trauma that you're going through? And the person said, I have just broken up with my significant other and I need time to recover. And the manager was stumped. And the instinctive response of the manager was, wow, if we took leave for every breakup, then and the colleague reacted to say, but this is contributing to my mental health not being there, and I expect you to be more sympathetic. Now, the reason I'm giving you this example is because we really need to demonstrate much more flexibility. I'm not going to touch upon the debates of 70-hour work weeks and, what do you want to do on Sunday and stare at your partner and all of that have been
Right.
doing the rounds in India. But
Right.
I will say that when it comes to working with a multi-generational workforce, at every people touch point, we have to look at what is that common minimum that we are driving, but then what is the room for flexibility that we are providing? Performance experiences, for instance. Why do we have to look at annual performance cycles? Why can we not embed real-time feedback? And that is something that, I'm really proud of S&P Global for having introduced. Learning again, right? The reality is everybody has their own preferences, and creating an ecosystem that encourages so that different people can learn in ways that work for them is so much more powerful. And I'm going to give you another S&P Global example where we've created an ecosystem where we've got a standing career coaching team available to all colleagues across the world. We have learning academies within the organization that are pull based. We have programs that are offered. We also have like an essential tech academy, an AI academy that looks at cutting edge technology. We have access to resources like Big Think Plus, which is a partner, which is bite-sized videos to drive skill building or learning of particular concepts. And then we also have an education reimbursement allowance for colleagues across the world in case there is a certification or upskilling that they need to do, which is not available within the company. I know I've taken a bit of time to explain this point, but the reason that I'm belaboring this point is because today it is incumbent on us as HR to think in an agile way and to offer consistently agile practices while being true to the core of the organization, which is our philosophy, our values, and where we are heading.
Yeah, no, I'm glad that you took that time to really explain all of that to us because it is a multifaceted approach. It requires more 360-degree thinking. When you are catering to people from different backgrounds, from different walks of life, you've got to, I think flexibility is what it all comes down to, right? And
Yeah.
you've also quoted, if you don't mind right now, me putting you on the spot a little bit, Bhavna, but there's a
Mhm.
quote by Charles Darwin that you really love, talking about, right? About the idea that it's not the fittest, it's not the smartest, it's the one that's most adaptable to change that's going to survive. So I think flexibility
Yes.
kind of ties into that really perfectly. So let's get into some key strategies for hiring and retention now, Bhavna. Every
Mhm.
company always, no matter what generation they're looking at and operating in, wants the best
Mhm.
of the best, right? So in today's scenario, when you're looking at, Gen Z really becoming a part of the workforce, what are the three key strategies that you think one needs to implement if they want to, make the best of the talent out there?
Yeah. The first one that I'll talk about is social networks. How do we create our social presence and leverage the power of social networks to attract Gen Z talent into the organization, right? The power of this is that it's about creating connections, and Gen Z is the hyper connected generation. So leveraging social networks is very, very powerful. So that's one. I think the second one that I will talk about is being very clear and unequivocal about what is your value proposition, but not in the way of having a bunch of words on a slide. It's about the stories that we tell, right? What is that value proposition? So, for example, we don't live in a world of career ladders anymore. We don't live in a world of career paths anymore. We live in a world of career lattices. And that's a great thing to say, but what does that mean? How, through our employee value proposition, can we paint the picture of possibilities for our Gen Z colleague? Talk about people who've been successful, people who've joined, let's say, from campus and how their trajectory has been, or people who've come in laterally and how they've grown, or even more relevant, people who have done gig roles in the organization and the kind of opportunities that has created for them, or even apprenticeship roles. I think it's about focusing on the value proposition, because at the end of the day, when we look at the consumption pattern of Gen Z, they are focused on uniqueness. They are focused on what's in it for me. And the value proposition of the organization should cater to that. I think the third thing is really, and this is where I'm going to also strongly balance the organizational point of view, which is to say, set expectations upfront. So I really believe that, for example, when you do career fairs, instead of doing physical career fairs, if you can do digital career fairs or some form of an online career fair where you are also talking about what does it take to be successful, and you use that opportunity to really talk about two or three non-negotiables. So for example, performance standards, right? Why should any organization shy away from saying we are a high performance culture? Right. I will tell you, at S&P Global, we are proudly people forward in our approach. Our people are at the heart of everything that we do, but we are also very clear that we are a performance driven organization and the customer is at the core of everything that we do. So when your recruitment approach is focused on, one, ensuring you're leveraging the power of social networks. Two, bringing to life your value proposition through stories. And three, using non-traditional means, like, for instance, I spoke about digital marketplaces for talent, this whole aspect of farm to table. So really partnering with universities and colleges to help talent be industry ready. I think these are some of the approaches that would really work.
Again, very actionable insights there as well. But once you've got all of the best talent working with you, how do you make sure you're keeping them? And I think, retention has been one of the key focus areas in the field of HR for the past couple of years, especially post COVID, right? And I think multi-generational. But since we're focusing on Gen Z, what do you think are the three most important things that HR professionals need to make sure that they are implementing in the workplace that will push members of the Gen Z workforce to stay?
Yeah, I'm actually going to pivot that question a little, Ahalya, and I will say that it's not just HR,
Mm-hmm.
right? In most organizations, if you have 100 employees, you're going to have maybe 10 to 12 managers and maybe one HR manager. So it's not the one HR manager who's going to be able to create that impact for the 100 employees. It'll be the 10 to 12 managers enabled by the one HR manager who will create that impact, right? So I really believe that the way to create retention is to create meaning and to support purpose. People stay when they feel that they are working with an organization which is in line with their values and their purpose. So, two or three very, very simple things. How do we create challenges? people get bored very quick, and maybe this is a reflection of me as well, and I'm doing a little bit of projection. But how do we create compelling experiences for people so that they are learning continuously? That's something for us to be mindful of, right? But at the same time, it's also about building that expectation that, listen, every job that you're in is going to have its really fun, high adrenaline, high visibility aspects, but it will also have the nitty gritty, the grunt work that is involved. And creating that discipline for it is very important. But the first one being diverse experiences, as I said. The second one being challenge. I think creating that openness to challenge and to being challenged. And this is where I do believe a little bit of the generational piece that does play out. Because, I will tell you, I'm very, very lucky because my parents are extremely broad minded. But even with them being extremely broad minded, sometimes having a contra point of view is seen as not necessarily being respectful. We can't bring that into the organization. Having a contra point of view is perfectly all right, right? So diversity of perspective, diversity of thought, diversity of ways of working is very, very important. And really channeling that in an appropriate manner, I think that's the other very important aspect to retention. And the third one is authentic communication. Don't hide. Share the facts the way they are, as long as they are publicly shareable, and you will get far more support than if you try to sugarcoat things. And these are the aspects that I think will really help with Gen Z retention.
So, Bhavna, taking from that, aside from the obvious pitfall of not being able to attract and retain the best of Gen Z talent using these strategies, right? What are some of the other long-term pitfalls of not attuning your workplace to fit these strategies or to incorporate them in daily functioning?
I think it's all about relevance at the end of the day. I don't want to make this more complicated than it needs to be. Organizations need to be agile, organizations need to be relevant, organizations need to be value adding. And if you need to be agile, relevant, and value adding, you have to be inclusive as a place where people feel comfortable to bring their whole selves and they feel that they will be able to excel, they will have that opportunity, and there aren't biases at play that come in the way, which they have to constantly fight off.
Short and sweet, but very impactful indeed, Bhavna. And we've quickly reached the end of the conversation. I do not know where the time has gone. But before we conclude, I do want to get your thoughts on how HR professionals who belong to the Gen Z workforce, how do they kind of navigate these strategies and their implementation to make the best of the moment?
Yeah, just two thoughts over there. One, entitlement is not a good look for anybody. Whether you're a colleague, whether you're a partner, I think it's about stepping out of your own shoes and trying to appreciate the realities of the world around you and striking a win-win. Very specifically for colleagues from the HR space, I would say a couple of things. One, I believe now more than ever before, appreciating the realities of human psychology is extremely relevant in what we do. We don't just run processes. We don't just run policies. We are trusted partners and we are as much the business as anybody running any other function, right? Commercial or otherwise. And therefore, in this journey, appreciating the psyche, appreciating the mindset, appreciating where do we want to go as an organization, and then tailoring our approach to keep in mind simplicity, to keep in mind impact, to keep in mind continuous learning and growth. I think those are the elements that I would urge HR professionals to really focus on. Please don't get lost in the jargon. Please don't make it more complicated than it needs to be. This is a time when simplicity counts, not complexity.
Oh, absolutely. I think in today's day and age, cutting through the noise is of utmost importance. Thank you for that reminder, Bhavna. And thank you so much for all of your insights on this episode of Great FM. This can be a tricky one to navigate. And I think you've seamlessly combined the experiential with the factual and given all of our listeners some really valuable insights. Thank you for being here.
Thank you very much for having me here.
All right, stay tuned to our series, everybody. We'll be bringing you another interesting conversation from the world of HR so that you can stay caught up on everything you need to know. But in the meantime, as always, stay safe and stay happy.
This is greytFM, a podcast series by greytHR. Produced by Timber Media.